Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be continuing our series covering the differences between World of Tanks and War Thunder. Now, being able to move around the battlefield is all well and good, but at the end of the day, you do actually have to interact with the other players. So the main way you interact with the other players is obviously by shooting them. And the first thing we're going to cover in this section isn't so much the process of shooting, but a feature that War Thunder has and World of Tanks doesn't, and that is actually pretty helpful in the attack process, as you will see when we start going into how you actually penetrate or damage hostile vehicles. In the game of War Thunder, you can go up to any vehicle in any tech tree, you can hit the drop down menu and select the preview option. What this does is it brings up a separate interface where now you can do an x-ray view to see what all the internals look like, you can see what all the modifications look like, what all the stats look like, and more importantly, there is an armor protection analysis. In this protection analysis, you don't just get to see the armor and its effective thickness against different shells, but you can also select any vehicle in the game and then any shell available to that vehicle and just fire it at the vehicle in the protection analysis to see how different shells react and what type of damage you can expect to do. This is an invaluable tool for newer players, and I don't know why the developers don't hype this up more, because it is very useful if you're having trouble with specific vehicles. For example, if you were struggling to figure out how to penetrate a Panther using an 76 Sherman, you just bring up the protection analysis for the Panther in question, go to the little drop down, select the 76 Sherman, select whatever shell you are interested in firing at it, and then just click away. It also has a heat map you can activate to show you potential protections. In World of Tanks, the game doesn't have this natively. You have to go to external clients such as tanks.gg. Additionally, you can go to any vehicle that you either currently have or that you are in a position to research, or alternatively any premium vehicle, and you can simply select the test drive option. The test drive option will put you on a range that has not only different terrain types but also different targets, and you can even select different conditions for the test drive, such as different times of day, etc. And it's very weird to me that World of Tanks, despite being 10 years old and despite these kind of test drives or firing ranges being very common with a lot of modern games, haven't even talked about adding something like this to the game yet. And it is pretty nice to have in War Thunder if you just want to check out how a vehicle performs other than just something like basic stats. Now, in order to shoot an enemy, the first thing you're going to have to do is select a shell type. World of Tanks has a total of 3 different shell types per tank. Some do only have 2, but this is pretty uncommon and the vast majority will have 3. The first shell is going to be your basic shell type. These do standard penetration and standard damage, and these are generally your bread and butter shells. The next shell type is the high explosive shells. High explosive shells generally have very low penetration but also have very high damage, so they're pretty useful if you see something that's lightly armored and that you want to do more damage to in a shorter period of time, or you just want to save yourself some shots. Additionally, they can sometimes do chip damage if they don't fully penetrate the enemy's armor. However, this is based on how thick the armor they're hitting is, so against particularly heavily armored opponents, this will often do very little or nothing. This is also a pretty noteworthy change because if you had played World of Tanks back in the day, high explosive shells used to function quite differently. They would actually check within an area to find the weakest part of armor to penetrate, so even against heavily armored opponents, they could often find much weaker pieces of armor and would do more damage. Additionally, they used to search in an AoE, whereas now they only search the target point, so what this means is you can't really splash other targets with high explosive like you used to back in the day. I still fondly remember my very first double kill, and my only double kill was something that wasn't an artillery in the FV4005, where I took out an opponent with a HESH round and also knocked out an enemy nearby that was around a corner. It was a pretty funny moment, but not currently something you can do in World of Tanks as it is. The third shell type is premium or gold ammo if you're a watt boomer like me, and this has the same damage as your standard shell but has better penetration. You might rightfully be thinking, if it has the same damage but better penetration, why wouldn't you always use it? The main answer is really economic. They usually cost significantly more silver, to the point where if you're just maining gold ammo, it's very easy to go negative in a match, especially if you don't have a premium account. There are other shell attributes. APCR tends to have worse normalization, heat rounds can detonate on obstacles, as can high explosive rounds. However, most of the time this doesn't really come up, as the World of Tanks maps aren't really built in such a way that these features are a big factor in terms of what type of shell you choose. So 9 times out of 10, the premium ammo or the gold ammo is just the best choice if you can afford to shoot it. Now, you can switch between shell types by hitting the number key. However, by default, hitting it once will only make sure the next shell you fire is of that type. If you hit it twice in rapid succession, it will actually start a new reload of that new shell type without costing you the old shell. There can also be some other attributes associated with different shell types based on the vehicle. For example, high explosive shells might have a lower velocity, so if you want to lead a target, it will be more difficult, but that does vary from vehicle to vehicle. Unlike World of Tanks, War Thunder tends to be a lot less regimented and consistent about exactly what shell types you will have access to, or even how many. For example, the Chinese PTZ-89 has a whopping 2 shells, an APFSDS round, and a high explosive round, and if you want to be using a different round, you should probably select a different tank. The American M47, on the other hand, has a whopping 7 different shells, of which 2 are only slightly different APCR shells. And you might ask, what is the point of 2 shells that have basically the same characteristics and slightly different stats? Well, it isn't economic like it would be in a game like World of Tanks. It's actually just related to the researching tech tree. You have to research one of the APCR shells to get to the other APCR shell. That's because in War Thunder you research shells, and whereas in World of Tanks you actually research guns, and the shells for that gun are automatically unlocked. What this means is that not every shell in War Thunder has a direct in-game use, and some of them are just wholly redundant, especially after you have the vehicle fully upgraded. War Thunder also has a fairly bewildering array of different shell types, everything from simple solid pieces of metal all the way up to guided missiles with tandem warheads, and the game does an almost supernaturally bad job of explaining to the players exactly how all these shells work and what their use cases are. For this part of the video, just know that if it's a kinetic round with no explosive filler, you can shoot through obstacles like houses, trees, fences, sometimes. The game is actually really inconsistent about it, like it is with many other things. However, if you have things like HEAT-FS rounds, high explosive rounds, HESH rounds, they will detonate if they hit obstacles. Again, sometimes. The game is very inconsistent with its hitboxes. Infamously, the map Japan and its bamboo trees are actually pretty terrible for this. The big exception to all of this is the armor-piercing high explosive shells that will only explode if they go through a certain amount of armor, so these shells actually can be fired through some particularly thin obstacles like fences and trees, but will still detonate once they get inside of an enemy vehicle, and we'll go more about all of that when we talk about how you actually damage the enemy vehicles. If you want to reload a shell, you just hit the button associated with that shell type and fire the current shell out of the chamber. In War Thunder, you can't do a forced reload like you can in World of Tanks, where it simply replaces the shell on the spot. You simply have to select the round and then fire your current round out of the chamber, and your next round will be the selected one. This is also a good time to mention the smoke round, which is a utility round that some tanks have access to that you can fire and will generate a smoke screen, either to cover a lane so you can cross it or to blind enemies. World of Tanks currently does not have a feature that is analogous to this. Now that we have our shell loaded, let's try to actually shoot it at the enemy. Now, in World of Tanks, it's very notable that the game automatically does elevation for you. So while you might have to lead a target, you don't have to aim upwards at all to hit a target that is particularly far away. Additionally, World of Tanks doesn't use negative lead, and we'll go more into what negative lead is when we go into War Thunder, because that game actually does use negative lead. But for the purposes of this section, all you really have to know is that in order to aim at an enemy that is perfectly stationary, all you have to do is put the crosshair on that enemy and pull the trigger. Now, because the game does automatically calculate elevation for you, even with particularly low velocity guns, it's actually kind of difficult to hit somebody you can't see. It is technically possible, but it basically requires fooling the game into thinking that you're shooting at something other than what you're really shooting, which requires very specific setups of enemies and terrain to work, and most players will go through years of playing and never see this setup. Now, the artillery class in World of Tanks obviously does have a way to indirectly fire at targets. However, because it functions so differently from every other vehicle, we're going to cover them separately later in this comparison. There is one interesting point to bring up in terms of World of Tanks, and that is all of the guns are effectively fully stabilized. That is to say, as long as the gun has the elevation and traverse angles and speed to keep up with your target, they will stay on your target. However, just because your gun will stay on target doesn't mean your shells will always land there, and that brings us to our next topic. World of Tanks has 2 values that govern whether or not you will hit your target. The first one is accuracy, and the second one is dispersion. Accuracy is your likelihood to hit a specific part in the middle of the aiming circle, and dispersion is actually how big your aiming circle gets, i.e. the area your shell can potentially hit. Good accuracy with poor dispersion means you will hit the center more often, but the area that your shell can deviate is very large. On the other hand, poor accuracy with really good dispersion means the area your shell can land is relatively small, but your likelihood of hitting dead center is actually pretty low. So in general, a tank with good accuracy but bad dispersion is an ideal sniper because at long range, any deviation is probably going to miss anyway, and a tank with good dispersion but poor accuracy is a great close range brawler because the enemies are up so close you don't actually need to hit dead center. Of course, your accuracy isn't static, and this is how the game represents guns being particularly unstable. You'll notice the circle on the outside gets bigger the more you move and turn your turret, and even after you fire a shot. However, if you sit there and aim in very carefully, the shell will get smaller and smaller until eventually it is the smallest size it can get. Once the circle is as small as it can get, you are now fully aimed, and there is nothing you can do to increase your accuracy further. This can lead to situations where you are debating whether or not you need to fully aim your shot as somebody else is bringing their gun to bear on you, or if you just want to take the dice roll and fire while it is not fully aimed, which of course is an interesting risk-reward mechanic. Combined, however, these systems do mean that you can perfectly aim your shot and completely miss, or you can just fire in the enemy's general direction and not aim particularly well and still directly hit. These are pretty rare, however, and the system on the whole does favor good decision making and good aim. One notable feature in World of Tanks is the auto-aim feature. What auto-aim does, if you put your crosshair on an enemy and press the button, it will lock on your gun to that target. So as long as the gun is physically capable of moving in such a way that it can stay on them, it will stay on them. The drawback of this system is that it only locks onto center mass, so if you need to hit weak points, it's not very good. Also, it doesn't apply any lead, so especially at longer ranges, it's not very useful. It's mostly useful for lighter and more mobile tanks if they're circling around an opponent and want to focus on movement, to just lock onto a target, because often if you're hitting sides or backs, you don't really need to hit specific weak points. One of the first things you'll notice in War Thunder about trying to hit targets is that your gun is not fully stabilized, at least not early on in the game. There are some short stabilizers that will stabilize the gun out at low speeds, and of course once you get to modern tanks they are fully stabilized, but a lot of early tanks have fairly unstable guns. This can to an extent be mitigated, especially on tanks with good suspension and on flat level ground like paved roads, but obviously this does take some practice. War Thunder does require you to lead your shots, but it also requires you to apply elevation to those shots. So if you have a target that is particularly far away, you will have to either aim up or use the sight distance controls to manually set the distance in your sights. However, War Thunder does have nice graduated sights that will give you the range for you. Notably, War Thunder does have a rangefinder feature to try and get range to a target, and it also has a binocular feature that is a view that is basically above the commander's view that you can use the rangefinder in. You can use this with particularly low velocity guns and the feature to manually apply elevation to actually hit targets you can't see, basically acting as an artillery piece. Of note, in both War Thunder and World of Tanks, third-person shots don't have reduced accuracy. They are exactly as accurate as normal shots. However, because you're in the third-person view, it is generally more difficult to land them. One difference that might not be immediately obvious between the two games is actually that War Thunder uses negative lead. Now, negative lead is when your tank is moving and you have to compensate for your own vehicle's movement. So if I am moving from left to right, I will actually have to aim to the left of my target so that my movement carries a shell into the shot. It doesn't come up that much because, much like in real life, in War Thunder you will still get your best accuracy while being stationary or close to stationary, but it is important to factor in if you are taking shots while moving relatively quickly. This actually brings up an interesting quirk of War Thunder in that the temperature of the map you're on will actually affect your shell's performance. On colder maps, your shells will actually move slower, and on hotter maps, your shells will move faster. This isn't pronounced enough that most players will really notice, but it is coded in. The game does not currently use windage, so you don't have to calculate that. However, it wouldn't shock me if it was added in some update in the future, as they do really like adding features like that, and they have already added wind effects. As one final note, a small misconception on shooting in War Thunder is that there is no randomness. There actually is randomness, it's just very minor, and you only really notice it if you're shooting at long range with shells that have particularly poor accuracy. These will often be things like early sabos that are very unstable, or low velocity shells. This means that landing a shot in War Thunder is often much more about individual accuracy and your ability to lead targets than it is about any random factors. Unlike in World of Tanks, where every vehicle has the same optical zoom, in War Thunder the zooms range from profoundly useless to basically the James Webb Space Telescope and everywhere in between. It just kind of varies on a vehicle-to-vehicle basis and is based on authenticity, not gameplay. So we've selected the shell and hit the target. How do we get into the enemy's armor? In World of Tanks, you have a green, yellow, or red indicator to indicate your likelihood of penetration. However, one interesting eccentricity is that the variance on the shell penetration is a plus or minus of 25%, which is actually enough to where on a green indicator, in extreme cases, you can fail to pen, or on a red indicator, also in extreme cases, you can successfully pen, because the penetration variance is enough that even when it says red, it still might be possible. Additionally, World of Tanks has a mechanic called Overmatch. What Overmatch is if your shell's bore diameter is greater than 3 times the thickness of an armor plate, your shell will always pass through that armor plate 100% of the time. It doesn't matter how heavily angled it is, and it doesn't matter what its effective thickness or your penetration is. This overmatch mechanic is not really explained anywhere, but is very important to know, especially if you're using tanks with higher caliber guns, like some of the tank destroyers or some of the heavy tanks. War Thunder uses flat penetration values, so there is no real random element, or at least there shouldn't be. A while back, War Thunder implemented a system called volumetric shells and armor. Now, in the original version of the game, the armor plates were paper thin and had a stat saying they had X millimeters of protection, and a shell was also an infinitely thin, basically laser pointer line that had a stat saying it was X type of shell. The problem with this system was that a very large shell like the 152mm shell on a KV could go straight through a driver's vision port. This wasn't a huge problem, but it did create some weird situations. Volumetric theoretically fixes this by making all of the armor plates the actual correct thickness and the shells the correct thickness as well. However, it also introduced some significant inconsistencies wherein shells could catch on weird parts of a tank or multiple plates, and the system would kind of spaz out and not treat them correctly. In fairness, it's pretty rare that volumetric just completely messes up a shell's penetration, but it does happen. The two biggest volumetric offenders are the T-34's driver's hatch that for some reason blocks long 88 rounds pretty consistently, and the Panther's mantlet that is a complete lottery as to whether or not you'll penetrate it. So while in theory penetration shouldn't involve any random elements, sometimes it does feel kind of arbitrary. So now we've gotten a shell into the enemy's crew compartment, how do we actually destroy them? In World of Tanks, it's fairly straightforward. Your shell will have a damage value. That damage value can vary up to plus or minus 25% based on your dice roll, and once you have done enough damage to the enemy tank and reduced their health bar to 0, they are destroyed. Simple as. In War Thunder, the process is significantly more complicated. Essentially what you have to do is you have to reduce the number of crew down to the point where the vehicle can no longer move and shoot at the same time. In most vehicles, this will mean knocking them down to a single crew member. However, in the specific case of the Stridsvagn 103, because the driver has gunner controls, this will actually mean knocking out all 3 of the crew members. However, you don't necessarily have to fire 1 shell per crew member you want to knock out. This is where we start getting into additional systems you can knock out and additional shell damage. If you successfully hit an ammo rack and detonate it, the entire crew will be wiped out. Additionally, if you successfully hit a fuel tank and detonate it, the entire crew will be wiped out. On top of that, if it is an open top vehicle and you hit it with a high explosive round, the overpressure from the high explosive round will wipe out the entire crew. In fact, high explosive rounds, if it can penetrate the vehicle's armor, will automatically wipe out the entire crew. However, mostly this does just mean open top vehicles unless a vehicle is particularly lightly armored or you have a particularly powerful high explosive round. This is where one of the more notable features of War Thunder comes in, the little damage window at the top right hand of the screen. This damage window will show you what things you knocked out, not just in the display itself, but it will also have them listed underneath. It will tell you what crew members you knocked out, and it will tell you what crew members are remaining in the vehicle. This is a very handy thing to look at if you're a newer player and you don't necessarily understand what exactly you're shooting at. Additionally, this is where the preview and x-ray feature can come in handy, because in the x-ray everything is labeled, not just things like ammunition and fuel, but it will tell you which specific crew member is sitting in which spot, and this will in turn tell you where you need to aim to knock out something like, say, the gunner or the driver. Because a vehicle in War Thunder has to be able to both move and shoot, if the gunner or driver are knocked out, somebody else in the crew will move to take their place. It does take a short period of time to do this, however, but it is very notable that because the gunner or driver has to be replaced, you can theoretically knock out a vehicle's entire crew just by shooting the gunner or the driver in the face repeatedly. However, this is usually not the most viable tactic unless you're in a pretty specific situation. This also brings up the point that the reason why people will commonly shoot at crew members instead of ammunition or fuel tanks is because ammunition and fuel tanks don't always explode. Sometimes they will just go black in case in that situation you simply can't use them. Additionally, ammunition, and this is something very important to note, and it's the reason why most War Thunder players don't take full ammunition loads, ammunition and its location is updated in real time in your vehicle. So if you have 5 rounds in your tank, there are only 5 rounds in your damage model that can potentially be detonated. So it's important to keep this in mind. There is a feature called first stage ammo racks in the game, and these first stage ammo racks represent a position where the loader can easily get to the shells, and your crew will generally move shells into this first stage ammo rack if they have the time to do so between shots. So unless you know where the enemy's first stage ammo rack is, which is usually the place where they keep shells, it's often not a good idea to aim for shells in other parts of the vehicle. Of note, however, the damage report in the top right of the screen will only show shells that are currently in the vehicle, so if you do see undetonated shells in that report, those are free reign to shoot at. This is also where one of the most significant aspects of shell properties that we didn't discuss earlier comes up, and this is how the shell actually does damage. Things like armor-piercing shells, sabos, etc. will generally do damage in a cone. So if you're going to shoot it, you have to shoot generally pretty close to where you want to actually damage. Conversely, high explosive shells or armor-piercing high explosive shells will actually do damage in a sphere. So if you get those in the crew compartment at all, they will often do critical damage. This is the reason why APCR that has fairly poor damage and only does it in a narrow cone is often not used even though it has high penetration, whereas armor-piercing high explosive that does damage in a very large sphere and will generally knock out the entire vehicle if you get it anywhere in the crew compartment is often used over shells that have much better penetration. But of course, destroying an enemy vehicle isn't the only negative effect you can have on them. You can knock out systems and crew members. In World of Tanks, knocking out all systems and crew members is essentially just a dice roll. Not only is it a dice roll, but it's a dice roll that you can improve with some of your crew skills, but the enemy can also degrade by having their own crew skills. For this reason, a lot of internal systems aren't generally shot at least not intentionally, by World of Tanks players. The only common critical hit that World of Tanks players will usually aim for are your tracks, because this completely immobilizes you and you cannot move in any capacity. Now, there are two stages of damage for each of your systems. One of them is yellow and the other one is red. When a system is yellow, it's simply operating at a reduced capacity. When it's red, it is no longer operational. If a system is no longer operational and it's red, your crew will begin repairing it automatically, which usually takes about 5 to 10 seconds depending on factors like crew skills. Once it is repaired from red, however, it goes back to being yellow, so it's still damaged. The only way to get it back to being fully healthy is to use a repair kit. A small repair kit will instantly repair one of your systems, a large repair kit will instantly repair all of your systems. If you're wondering what the difference is between a small and large repair kit and why you would ever use a small repair kit, the difference is economic. A large repair kit costs 20,000 silver per use, so obviously it is prohibitively expensive, especially if you're a free-to-play player. Crew work very much in the same way, and if you want to get your crew back, you will have to use either a small med kit to heal one crew member or a large med kit to heal all crew members. Yet again, the difference is the same. It is 20,000 silver for a large repair kit, so it is prohibitively expensive. And consumables like small repair kit, large repair kit, and fire extinguishers all have a cooldown timer of 60 seconds before you can use them again. If your vehicle gets set on fire, it will start taking over damage, and eventually the fire will burn itself out, but you will take a fairly considerable amount of damage unless you put the fire out. A small fire extinguisher you have to activate manually. A large fire extinguisher is automatically activated after only the first few ticks. Obviously, the difference is purely economic between these two fire extinguishers. For something like an ammo explosion, your vehicle is just dead, you lose all of your hit points right away. While aiming for critical systems is something you almost never do in World of Tanks, it's basically the only thing you do in War Thunder. As you probably saw, that's the only way to really do damage to an enemy vehicle. Knocking out tracks, knocking out engines, knocking out gun barrels, these are all very common practices in that game. If a crew member or system is damaged but is not wholly knocked out, it will simply operate at a reduced capacity, and this is represented by them being yellow, orange, red, etc. If it is fully knocked out, a crew member will either have to be replaced or you'll just have to get on without them, and a system will have to be repaired. The only way to replace an incapacitated crew member is to go to a capture point and hit the crew replenishment button. You can only do this one per battle, so you only have basically one spare crew member. And even then, only if you have researched the crew replenishment modification. For systems, you need to start repairing the system in order to actually get it operational, the only exception being tracks, where your crew will start fixing it right away. Now, of note, if you don't have the parts modification researched, you won't be able to repair it to full capacity. In the example in the background, you can see my engine is heavily damaged, but I don't actually have parts, so I am doddering along at a mere 7 kilometers an hour, trying to get to a capture point. If you get to a capture point, you can repair even if you don't have parts. Additionally, nearby teammates that have the parts modification research can also help you, or if you are on a capture point or you have teammates nearby, they can also help speed up the process even if you do have parts research. While an ammo explosion will simply destroy you like it does in World of Tanks, ammo can just be damaged to the point where it's no longer usable. In that case, you can replenish it on capture points. In terms of fire, the fire will start doing damage internally, but it doesn't actually directly destroy systems, and it takes a while for it to brew up. So you actually do have a minute before you have to hit the fire extinguisher button to put the fire out. You start out with one fire extinguisher by default, and you can research the option to carry another one, or teammates can help you with a fire extinguisher if you don't currently have any remaining. The reason why you will often see players wait to put out fires is because the fire will take a while to kill you, but your crew will have to stop reloading and operating the tank in order to put it out. So most players would rather simply eliminate the threat first and worry about the fire later, because putting out the fire simply to be shot in the face doesn't really help you all that much. That being said, if you don't eventually put out the fire, it will eventually take out your vehicle. It doesn't simply do a set amount of damage like it does in World of Tanks. One very notable difference between World of Tanks and War Thunder is that while in World of Tanks, knocking out a single track will completely immobilize the vehicle, in War Thunder, while it does stop you from moving forward, it doesn't stop you from moving at all. You can still rotate the vehicle around on the other track if you feel you're perhaps a little too exposed and want to rotate your hull out of the way of enemy fire. One fairly notable difference between War Thunder and World of Tanks is how they handle things like multiple weapons and autoloaders. In World of Tanks, it doesn't really have multiple weapons. There are a handful of tanks that use a double-barreled mechanic. However, this is realistically just one weapon that basically has a magazine of 2 shells, and that you can charge up a super shot where you fire both barrels. That's really about it. In all other instances, it kind of just functions like a normal gun with a magazine. Autoloaders, on the other hand, have a magazine, and while the shots within that magazine are relatively rapid, the magazine itself usually takes a while to reload. Or at least that kind of used to be the case. World of Tanks has been experimenting with a lot of other ways to do autoloaders recently, so some of them do break this mold a little, but you can always tell if a vehicle has an autoloader by looking at the left-hand side of the aiming reticle, because this will show you the number of rounds remaining in the magazine. Additionally, you can force reload the entire magazine at any time, even if you haven't necessarily fired all the shells. When it comes to War Thunder, however, when a vehicle has multiple weapons, all of those weapons will be modeled and functional on the vehicle, or at least most of them will be. Most commonly, this just includes things like hull-mounted or coaxial machine guns, possibly roof-mounted heavy machine guns, which are only really useful against aircraft or lighter targets. However, some vehicles, such as the American M6, does have a coaxial 37mm and 2 hull-mounted 50 calibers, meaning even if it's fired its main gun, its 3-inch gun, it's still a legitimate threat to lightly armored vehicles. Additionally, you have vehicles like the Magog Hydra that just has 2 Hydra rocket pods strapped to either side of the barrel that you can fire in addition to the main gun, meaning it's still a legitimate threat to everything, even while on reload. For autoloaders, the game basically uses the first stage ammo mechanic. However, instead of a normal vehicle where running out of first stage ammo just means you reload slower, and an autoloader, if you run out of quote-unquote first stage ammo, that means your magazine is empty and your gun cannot fire at all until you have refilled that magazine. And it does take a while to refill the magazine. You will see your crew automatically starts doing it if you have any downtime in the battle. However, if you're constantly firing, you might have to go to a capture point to do this, or retreat from the battle for a while. Of note in War Thunder is that autoloaders, unlike in World of Tanks, are not actually natively faster at firing unless they are faster at firing in real life, and the only innate advantage they give you is that they will continue loading irrespective of your crew status. So while some vehicles do fire faster, you also have vehicles such as the Russian T-90 that has a 7.1 second reload, which is actually relatively slow compared to all of the NATO 120mm guns it fights. Now, there is one final and kind of intangible aspect of the attack process that we haven't really gone through, and that is what happens when you actually destroy the enemy. In World of Tanks, this is pretty straightforward. When you destroy the enemy, they just become a burning hulk, and also they leave a small pop mark on the ground around them. Additionally, when you take damage, you will have damage decals applied to your vehicle. This is fine and functional, if unspectacular. In War Thunder, when vehicles take damage, you can often see it directly represented on the vehicle itself. This comes in the form of things like dented fenders, busted fuel tanks, etc., and this can make the vehicles look impressively battle-worn after an engagement. Additionally, when you destroy the enemy vehicle, sometimes they will just turn into a burning hulk, but sometimes you will get some pretty spectacular explosions, especially if you hit an ammo rack. These are also randomized and rare enough that they don't exactly wear out their welcome, and nothing quite gets the dopamine going like seeing the enemy's tank being turned into a giant crater while their turret and road wheels fly in different directions and are on fire. One of the big strengths of World of Tanks is obviously the fairly shallow learning curve. Enemy has health bar, make health bar go down is a fairly easy association. initiation for somebody to make, even if they know very little about tanks. War Thunder's rather absurd complexity, both in terms of shell types and damage models, and how you're actually supposed to both get a shell into the crew compartment and do meaningful damage to an enemy, is probably one of its biggest drawbacks, because it puts a very steep learning curve on simply trying to get access to the most basic part of the game, that is, destroying enemy vehicles. And that wraps up this installment in the series. Hope you enjoyed it, hope you had fun. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and obviously subscribing to the channel will make sure you won't miss additional installments in this series. As always, don't forget to shoes.